Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. In this video I'm going to be planting up my two new Venus Flytraps here. So I've gone off and I've ordered some of the biggest Venus Flytraps I could find. I've got this variety here which is called B52, and I've got this variety here which is called Darwin, and these are supposed to have much bigger traps than many of the other plants. Darwin even won a prize for having some of the biggest traps. I think 5 centimeters were the largest it was measured with that one. B52 is a much more well known one. Probably one of the best well-known Venus Flytraps. Tends to have absolutely massive traps. You can see this one here is particularly large already. Now it's just spring, so they're just coming out of dormancy, so they're not going to have the biggest traps yet. But come midsummer or late summer, I should have some giant traps and they'll be looking really good. B52 tends to be quite a dwarf one. Large traps, but the petioles here, the little bit of stem between the trap and the main part of the plant, tends to be quite small. It's quite a compact plant. Darwin, by contrast, does have much longer petioles. You can see this one here. This must have been one from last summer, and it's really quite a long stem. You can see a lot of the new ones are coming up. They're not quite as tall yet, but come later in the year I suspect it will be quite a bit taller. So I'm going to be planting this in an oven dish. So I got this from a local charity shop, second hand. I got it because it's completely sealed, so I don't have to worry about any water draining through. Also means I can keep this nice and wet, so I don't have to worry about it drying out. If it was free draining, then it would drain out too fast. I will have to be careful though not to waterlog the plants, because although they do grow in marshy, boggy conditions, they don't like to be sitting in water. So I'll create a little well in the middle of this oven dish, and that'll be let me see what the height the water level is at, and then that way I can make sure it doesn't get too much water or too little. But it's also quite a nice ornamental one, and it's also quite thin. So although it's quite long, so I can get a lot of plants in, but at the same time it's not too wide for my windowsill, so it should work out quite well. The only problem with this is it is a little bit shallow. You can see there's not a lot of depth to that, and ideally I would have a bit more depth from these Venus Flytraps. So it might be a little bit tricky putting the plants in here, see if I can do it or not with the tubers, but I'll go ahead and see how it goes. So I'm using special carnivorous compost here, and it needs to be special compost for Venus Flytraps because where they grow in the wild, they don't have normal soils. They have very peaty soil, and the soils have almost no nutrients in them, and that's why the Venus Flytraps have to collect insects, because that's the only way of obtaining any sort of nutrients. So this has got absolutely no fertilizer or additives added to it. It's basically just sphagnum peat moss, and it just had a little bit of perlite added for some drainage. As I say, they don't like to be completely saturated, the soil. They do like a little bit of free draining to the soil, but generally they need to be kept wet. So this is going to be perfect conditions for it. If I did put them in normal compost, there'd be too much feed in it, and the plant roots aren't used to having any nutrients in the soil, so the plants really suffer if there's any kind of fertilizers in the soil. So that's hopefully about enough. Compost is already a little bit damp, but I'll certainly need to give it a good water once I've actually planted the plants in. Will be a little bit tricky because the tubers on this tend to extend down a few centimeters, so I'll just carefully take this one out and see what I can do. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take off the bottom layer of soil, see how much I can take off. Hopefully I can get it thin enough that it'll fit inside this container. That's almost thin enough. I'm only going to expose as much as I need, and then dig a little hole and see if I can pop it inside. That should be just about deep enough. I do want to see if I can take a little bit more soil off the bottom just in case. It's starting to fall apart now, unfortunately. I think this must have been potted up quite recently because it's very loose compost. You can see it's all falling off there. That's the tubers I was talking about. It's basically swollen parts of the leaf at the bottom. They're not too deep on this one, so it should be fine to put in. I'm just going to spread out the roots a little bit to make sure the roots are not directly all clumped up together. And then I'm just going to fill around with some damp compost. So there we are. That one should be quite happy actually. As I said, that looked like it had been just recently repotted because the roots weren't really sticking to the soil at all, and the compost looked very fresh. This one, however, it's got some moss growing in the top, so I presume it's been in here for a little while. I will actually try and remove the moss because I find with my previous Venus Flytraps, the moss tends to take over the entire pot. It is helpful if you got it outside, I suppose. It does keep the weeds down, but I want to try and keep the moss at a minimum if I can. Just going to be very careful that I don't break any of the leaves or the stems of the plant. So that appears to be all the moss away, and now I just need to reduce the amount of soil on the bottom again to make sure it will fit in this shallow container. Normally you wouldn't want to be taking all the compost off of Venus Flytraps unless you're separating them, but just because I have such a shallow pot, I'm having to do this. So there we are. You can see again that these tubers aren't too long on this one. They are quite short, so they'll fit in no problem. And the compost is sticking to this a bit more, so I don't think it's been repotted too long ago. So same again, I'm just going to make a little hole for it to pop into. Spread the roots out as best I can without damaging them too much. And then just very gently firm in the compost to support the plant. So that's those two now potted in. What I need to do now is give it a really good soak, and I'll just create a little well in the middle so I can keep an eye on the water levels, just so it doesn't get too much water. And what I'll do is I'll expose the very bottom of the pot, and when I see that there's no water sitting in the very bottom, I'll give it another water. What I'll do is I'll pour the water directly into here, then it will just soak up into the compost. This rich peat compost tends to soak up water very well, especially if it's already damp, so it'll easily spread around the whole section of the pot. So there we are, that's a little well created. As I say, I'll just keep that topped up. I won't ever let the water become too thick though. I just want a very shallow layer of water, so that means that it's always wet, but it's never waterlogged. If I let it come up several centimetres, that would waterlog the soil and damage the plants. So all that's left to do now is give this a water and wash off any of the excess compost off the leaves of the Venus Flytraps. So I'm using distilled water for this because normal tap water can cause quite a few issues with the mineral content and that, and often there's also fertiliser that's been leached into the water system from farmers' fields. So I'm just going to gently wash off any of the compost to make sure that it's not buried the plants too much. And then, as I say, I'm just going to fill up the central well area, and that will all just soak in nicely into the compost. You'll see it'll quickly go down the level. I'll wait until it completely disappears and then just keep topping it up until I know the whole compost is nice and damp. So that seems to be about the right amount of water. It'll probably soak up a bit more because some of this compost on the surface is still a little bit dry. But I'll just keep it topped up, as whenever this central area dries out, I'll just make sure there's a very thin layer of water at the bottom. So that's it now for my Venus Flytrap. I'm going to put this in a very bright position because Venus Flytraps really need a very strong light source. Where they grow in the wild, they don't have any shade, it's just full sun the whole day in the swamp. So I'm going to give them as much light as I can. I'm also going to warm them up a little bit. I find when I grow my Venus Flytraps outside in Scotland, they don't do very well. It's a little bit cold in the summer. It's only about 18 degrees, whereas where these come from natively, they get slightly warmer temperatures during the summer, maybe up to 20, 25 degrees. So I'll keep this in the house for now. If we get some really warm weather, June, July, I'll put it outside. But otherwise, I'll keep this somewhere nice and warm, plenty of light. And I'll give you guys an update in a few weeks' time. Hopefully by then we should have plenty more new traps starting to grow in here, and there'll be nice healthy Venus Flytraps.